Hello, and welcome to Literacy Matters Empowered Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Cheryl Lundy Swift. I have had the distinct pleasure of hearing our next guest on several national panels, and I always leave more knowledgeable. Literacy Matters listeners, I am so excited that you will get to learn from Dr. Ramona Pittman. Dr. Pittman is an educator, researcher, and advocate for early literacy. She is committed to advancing reading instruction for diverse student populations, especially in underrepresented communities. Ramona has over 20 years of experience in education, and she holds a Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis on literacy. Her research, widely published in academic journals, champions evidence-based reading instruction that honors students' linguistic and cultural backgrounds, especially for speakers of African American English. In addition to her scholarly contributions, she has led numerous professional development workshops equipping educators with effective strategies to support diverse learners. Dr. Pittman frequently presents at national conferences and consults on educational initiatives aimed at closing the literacy opportunity gap. She emphasizes that a strong foundation in early literacy is critical to students' long-term academic success. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Center for Effective Reading Instruction and the International Dyslexia Association's Dyslexia Definition Steering Committee. She is also an associate editor for the Elementary School Journal. Additionally, she recently served on a panel for the word recognition at the Reading League Summit, and she was joined by esteemed experts David Kilpatrick, Susan Brady, and Linnea Erie. And the session was moderated by none other than Louisa Moats, and I had the privilege to be there and witness it all. Welcome, Ramona, to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's so great to have you on. You are doing such amazing work and really highlighting what we can do to support African American students especially, but of course, all students. So I want to start by saying to you, there might be people out there who are not as familiar with what we call African American English. Can you explain what some of the key linguistic features are of African American English?
We know just from research and other scholars and linguists in the field that the majority of African Americans AAE, and AAE is often referred to as Black language or Black English. Back several decades ago, people considered African American vernacular English, but the vernacular part has a negative connotation now, so that part has been pulled. So instead of AAVE is AAE. I still often, though, hear people asking me questions and use AAVE. In layman's term, some people may refer to it kind of from the past, though, as Ebonics.
You know, it's so interesting because I was wondering about how it was related to Ebonics back in the 90s. That was something that was pretty big. So thank you for clarifying that. So when we think about African American English or AEE, why is it even important for educators to recognize it as a legitimate linguistic system rather than perhaps a deficit?
Oh, it is vitally important because we know just from several studies that teachers, when they hear African American students, Black students use AAE, they consider those students, not all teachers, but just from research, as being lazy. They don't want to learn English, and I'm using quotes, I should say. And then they also consider them lazy, but also they consider AAE as slang. However, you would never tell a person who spoke Spanish or Japanese or Chinese or whatever the language is, you would never look down on them for having a second language. So I figure Black students also should be uplifted in their language that has been passed down from generations. And so when we uplift our kids, whether you consider the term African American or Black, it's very important to uplift our students because language is a part of their identity.
You know, it's so validating to me as an African American person from the South who grew up speaking what I didn't realize at the time, AAE. So I really appreciate your highlighting this. It's so important to me, and so important to think about how I was able to use what students already knew to be able to teach them standard English. So how does speaking AAE impact a child's experience when it comes to phonics and decoding in the classroom?
Okay, so my research, and several others, Julie Washington, Nicole Patton-Terry, Lakeisha Johnson, there's a whole list, who are doing this work. But just from my research, my initial focus in my research is on spelling. I've done classroom observations, and with the spelling samples from students who are spelling what we call General American English. So with my research, I've seen where students have made AAE related spellings because, again, when kids first begin to spell, they spell based upon the sounds that they hear. Now, we do know that the English language encodes morphemes, so it's a it's a morphophonemic language, meaning there are morphemes and phonemes in the way we spell words. However, when kids first spell, they will rely on what they hear. So if they pronounce a word a particular way, if they say bath, then if they don't actually have the General American English spelling for bath, which is BATH, they would spell it as BAF or something similar to represent the sound at the end of that particular word. As far as decoding, it does play a role because I was doing some observations actually on the East Coast, and I had a student who saw a picture of a cactus. It was a closed syllable lesson, so she had the initial syllable, which was cac, and she was trying to find from choice answers. She was trying to find the second syllable, and so she couldn't find a second syllable that began with the D sound, like in dog. And so that created a decoding problem for her
Sure.
in that she would have missed that item on her assessment because oftentimes with Rebecca Treeman's work, the D and T are often reversed so that you may say salad versus salad or ballad versus ballad. Now, Linnea Airy, whom you mentioned earlier, has a chapter, I want to say from 1985 or somewhere around that time, where this also happens with other speakers as well, because it's an articulation where your mouth has to move to a certain position. And so the word, like if you had the word sitting, you may say sitting versus sitting just because of articulation.
Wow, that's really, really, really amazing when you think about that. I love that example of the student really struggling with trying to find the right option because she was mistaking the t for the d. That's really, really amazing. Can you share some examples of how AAE, the grammatical structures or pronunciation patterns, might really further influence a student's spelling, encoding, or just their overall reading development?
So, two different things. So, phonologically, it will impact how they spell if they're spelling based upon the sounds that they hear. Because even as adults, when we don't know how to spell a word, and if we're not familiar with whether it has morphemes or not, and when I say morphemes, I'm thinking of suffixes, prefixes, Greek or Latin root words or bases, then we're going to literally rely on what we hear in a word. So I can give you a word like definitely. If you don't know how to spell it, you're going to say and then put a D and then put an E. So you're using the phonemes for that particular word and you're mapping it to a particular grapheme, which are letter or letters. As far as your question was about grammatical patterns, so in grammatical patterns, those can be affected by writing. So, for example, one of the grammatical patterns that is very prevalent is to leave out the verb. African American English speakers will often not use a verb in a particular sentence. So they may say, she's tired or something like that without saying she is, or he busy, or he hungry without using that verb there. What's called in General American English zero copula. They may do that. But then there's the habitual be where I may say, she be talking too much or something like that. Or she be telling people they're nice or something like that, where you're inserting the be verb. And there are several others. As one of my biggest issues with writing and even with speaking would be agreement patterns. So in General American English, the subject verb must agree in the sense of, if I say she and she is one person, then my verb has to be, so that's singular. So then my verb has to be singular. And in General American English, singular verbs have S's after them or ES's or whatever. So she plays. But if I was speaking, I would just say she played. Like she played a clarinet. That would be normal to me and what feels comfortable to me. But I know, for journal purposes or publishing purposes, it's going to come back for me to edit that to she plays. But it's more natural for me my agreement patterns and AAE speaker agreement patterns are different than General American English. And I should say that out of all the features, some people may use them more prevalent than others. So if you speak AAE, you may use certain features that I may not use and so forth. But one thing about it, most likely all AAE speakers understand each other without having to, get lost in translation and so
Sure.
forth.
Sure. So, when I think about this, I think about a person who may not be familiar with AAE or they might have a bias around AAE. And how can we help them support and better understand how to support students who speak AAE?
One of the things that I champion or really believe in is that language is your identity. So for me, especially in a classroom, if students are in group work or talking and using AAE, I think it's perfectly fine. However, I am a advocate of them also actually learning General American English. And so I believe in them using their full linguistic repertoire from two different languages. And so that way, and I'm going to quote Holly Lane because I was at the University of Florida about 2 weeks ago, and she having this discussion, and she said a phrase that really stuck out to me because it's what I've been saying, but she said it in a way that was so succinct. You want to give them access so they have access. So you want to give them access to the language so they have access. And that could be so that they can write that job application in General American English or that college application or whatever it takes so that they can also use General American English. So with that being said, there are still assessment practices where students are, I guess, deducted for speaking AAE, when most assessments say to not deduct points for speaking a dialect or language variation or a language and so forth, like if your language is influencing. However, most teachers may not know AAE, so then they don't know that African American students' language is influencing their responses. So, for example, if a student said friend and left off the final d sound, they will get a different number of phonemes if they were doing like a phonemic awareness task.
Sure.
Or they said there were 3 phonemes in lift for the word lift in General American English, then they would get points deducted.
Yeah.
So technically, you're not supposed to deduct points. However, as a teacher, I would keep some type of anecdotal notes just because I know that just from my research and others' research that if a student actually hears lift and they are never shown or honed in on the final t in that sound, then they will spell the word as lift if they're still spelling with their phonological skills.
I know our listeners now are wondering, okay, so I get it. Really, AAE is a second language. But what are some evidence-based instructional strategies that teachers can use to support students who speak AAE, whether it's decoding or encoding? Can you give us some strategies there?
I can't think of the researcher's name right now, but she has an article where she allowed students to create decodable text. And so they created the decodable text in AAE, so in the language that they spoke. But it would be nice, just like with bilingual text, to have AAE maybe on one page and then General American English on the other page so that they can compare both and understand that the message that is being used is the same. It's just that the language differs. Now, I must say that with AAE, sometimes you can try to, I guess, change it to General American English, but some things might get lost in translation. Lisa Green's work, 2002, she has a book, African American English, an Introduction. And in it, she talks about if you said she be telling people she's 8, I think that's the sentence she uses. If I conjugated that, it would be she is always telling people she's 8 years old, I should say. But technically, that could mean she's telling a story, she's lying, even though I wasn't allowed to use the word lying growing up. But so you may lose some of the meaning behind it because it's not just trying to transfer it to General American English, but then in AAE, there are also other meanings behind the particular phrases that you may be using. But I would definitely show them the differences between the two language. I would let them use their language that they're comfortable in speaking. But again, when it comes to assessments and when it comes to like spelling lessons, decoding, and so forth, I do wholeheartedly believe that you have to have systematic, explicit, direct instruction and structured literacy because, again, you want to give them access so that they can have access. And if they've never given that access, then they will end up in a class somewhere around 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade where they're just getting red marks for everything from spelling, teacher who doesn't even understand AAE, try to correct the student in front of his or her peers when we know that, again, language is identity and correcting students in front of their peers is something that should not happen because if that happened to me, I would just shut down
Sure.
because it would be embarrassing that the teacher's trying to tell me that I'm speaking incorrectly when that's all that I know.
Yeah.
But again, I do believe that especially in early literacy, you want them to be able to read. If our goal is to teach them to be able to read, then we have to teach them to read what's in front of them. And unfortunately, in this climate, I don't see AAE like a whole curricula coming out just for like all students and so forth. So the curricula, wherever they are, they have to be able to assess that curricula and access that curricula and then be able to use it and read from it and so forth, whether they're reading books in the library and so forth.
I'm gonna have to steal Holly Lane's quote there. I think she's a brilliant person, by the way. I had a chance to meet
I
her
know, she's
a few
awesome.
months ago. So again, give them access so they can have access. You mentioned thinking about how to support children and their identity. How can teachers actually affirm students' linguistic identity while also teaching them to navigate for capital S standard American English or general American English for academic purposes?
For one, the teacher can start by telling the students that their language is important. Their language has been passed down. The teacher should respect their language and build a classroom where the language is respected. And that's for any student, no matter what language is spoken. There should be a classroom where students feel compelled to share it without being ridiculed by the way that they speak and so forth. And just know, as a side note, that everyone in the United States speaks some form of a dialect, whether you're on the East Coast, whether you're from the South, Midwest, or what have you. And so teachers should value the students' language, again, lifting them up. And then when there are opportunities for direct, explicit, and systematic instruction, whether a small group or whatever, she can, if she has a predominantly, say like Black class or what have you, African American class of students, then it could be some lessons that she could do, whether if she's introducing a new word like blast, then just using phonemic awareness and sounding and segmenting those particular sounds out, and then mapping those sounds to graphemes if she was doing like spelling to show it on the board, so that students can hear each individual sound in that word and then map it to the correct grapheme. As far as decoding, going back to, so if you have opportunities for a full class, that should happen really with all students. So hearing each individual sound and then mapping it to the correct graphemes. But if there's still some problems with students who are not hearing those individual sounds, which we know with all students, sometimes phonemic awareness can be tough.
Yeah.
And so if there's still some issues with hearing those individual sounds and being able to map it to the correct graphemes for African American students, and you know that it's due to their language, then you could do some small group instruction where you are working with that student one-on-one, or maybe a small group of students, so that you're not saying, James, I'm doing this lesson for you in front of other kids, because that would be very demeaning and very thinking and so forth. And again, the reason I wholeheartedly believe in this is, again, giving them access.
Yes. Ramona, one of the most beautiful things that I get to experience when I'm interviewing people like you, it always takes me back to either when I'm a student, I'm a teacher, or I'm a school leader. And when you were talking about that, it brought me to a memory that I had. I used to read the announcements in high school, and it was something that I loved to do. And my sister was in the ninth grade. I was a senior at the time. I had to read the word ask, ASK. And back then, I knew the word as axe because that's how my family said it. And apparently that's how I read it. And my sister at the end of the day came up to me really, really upset because she shared that her teacher in front of everybody said, that's not how you say the word. The word is ask. And then really kind of really embarrassed me without me being there, I guess, kind of really demeaned me. And instead of me taking that and shutting down, I took that information and just said, okay, that's how you say the word. And I've never said axe again, right? But that's a choice that I made, right? Imagine had I been in that classroom and the teacher had done that to me, or she had done that in front of people and I was there. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes it's not, it's not because students are lazy or they don't want to know. It is what they have grown up saying, and it doesn't mean that they're less than.
Yes, and I still say ask. Like, that's what's comfortable to me.
Right.
But I do know it's spelled ASK if I was writing something. The only way I can say it is if I actually thought about it and said each phoneme very slowly, ask.
Right.
And I do that, like the overemphasis.
Right.
But if I'm just talking, and I probably do it at conferences, I have no idea. It
Sure.
sometimes things just come out faster. People don't realize we dialectal. So sometimes when we're doing presentations and teaching, the amount of somersault our brain is doing, trying to make sure we speak general American English, because just by the fact that so many people don't know about AAE, and so it has such a negative deficit thinking, then if people don't know me, then I have to think, oh, they're probably thinking I don't know how to say this or pronounce this. So we do have to show up as our true, authentic self. If I was doing a AAE presentation, I always tell my audience, and I probably should have started this podcast and say, hey, I speak AAE, so you're probably going to hear some. It's just how I feel comfortable speaking.
That's awesome, Ramona. Thank you. Thank you for showing up today as your authentic self. I appreciate it because I have learned so much from you. So how do cultural responsive practices support stronger literacy outcomes for speakers of AAE? And I'm thinking about Zaretta Hammond's work. I had a chance to talk to her. Can you share, what teachers can do in the classroom?
So, a group of colleagues and I wrote an article, it's still in review, but just making the science of reading culturally responsive. And we spent a great amount of time. Yes, we do need those skills from the National Reading Panel. We believe in simple view of reading, Scarborough's rope. So that's still, all of those skills still have to be taught directly, explicit, systematically. You probably are going to hear me say that repeatedly, but there's still in the cultural responsiveness needs to be attention to language and attention to identity and so forth. And so if teachers can just build students' identity by even just explaining the language, because for many Black students, they may not even know this is a thing, because I didn't know it was a thing or a
Right.
language until I started working on my Ph.D. I just know that sometimes, I would get red marks once I made it to high school, middle school,
Yep.
and started writing papers and so forth. But just making sure that the Black students understand their history and their language and how language AAE came about, and the fact that when enslaved Africans arrived in the U.S., many of them were on the same boat, and they may have not even communicated with each other because they were from different parts of Africa and so forth. AAE came about as a way that they can communicate with each other. Then, as you know, like the 50s and 60s, Black people migrated, left the South throughout the U.S., migrated throughout the U.S., and the language is, you know, spoken all across the US. So I can go to New York, I can go to New Orleans, I can go to California, LA, wherever, and I don't have to do any translation. So again, just a teacher going out and getting the professional development, knowing more about AAE, reading about AAE, reading research studies
Sure.
about AAE. Julie Washington's work, the patent theory as well, has done work on dialect density measure. What it shows is if a student speaks AAE, the more difficult it is for them to transfer to General American English. Those students usually have the most difficulty in reading. And so teachers would want to make sure, again, giving them access, that they can use students' General American English, use it, not tell them to leave it at home or what have you, but use those skills if teachers are aware of the skills that they're using, and then introduce General American English to them so that they actually have two different languages that they can draw on. So it's important for teachers to really understand African American English because, for example, if a student was spelling the word bath and they spelled it as BAF, then they can probably attribute that to AAE. Now, if they spelled bath as XKG, that's not AAE. That's a totally different thing, but the teacher needs the skill set to understand that.
Sure.
The teacher also needs the skill set to understand that, yes, in General American English, both of these students would have spelled this word incorrectly, but there's two different levels of instruction that needs to take place. We know that this is a simple African American English, this is how it's pronounced, so this is how it's probably spelled. Whereas with student number 2, this student is clearly not hearing hearing the phonemes correctly, but then knowing how to map them to the correct grapheme.
Sure.
So it's very important for teachers to understand the phonological features, especially for decoding and encoding, but also understand the grammatical features so that when students are writing or doing oral discourse or presentations, that they understand it as well and know when it's an AAE related spelling or writing or sentence versus something else going on.
Ramona, do you have a contrastive analysis? We oftentimes see with Spanish, for example, saying, "Oh, this is something that how a Spanish student might mistaken this particular sound or letter correspondence." We have something like that for AA?
We do, in the sense of it's mostly in professional books or in journal articles.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't know if it's in curricula, which is where it actually needs to be, and in standards, because that's what teachers most likely access. Generally, of course, but generally in most AAE articles, they will have, or books, they will have a table that will show you like the general American English way of pronouncing it, or if it's morphosyntactic or grammar. And then they'll have AAE, how it's pronounced or how it's said morphosyntactically. And there's an article by Hamilton et al. 2018. And in the article, they say that we should move away from deficit-based labels. So I've always said subject verb agreement. I've always said final consonant blend reduction. How can we reduce something that doesn't exist for African American students? So you'll start seeing like later publications that may use like final consonant blend variation or final consonant blend alternate production to show that this is a variation between General American English
Sure.
or mainstream English and AAE.
Right. That's great. I love it. And maybe we can, you can share some of those articles and we can link them for sure to this conversation. So, Ramona, one of the things that I think as we're on this mission to make sure that all students become more proficient readers and writers, and when I begin to look at the data or begin to field questions from school leaders or instructional coaches and ELA teachers, and we keep coming up short for our Black and Brown children in particular, our students with disabilities in particular, that these subgroups, if you will, are just not making the same kind of gains. How do you think African American English or the knowledge of African American English can impact our data and how our students are doing when it comes to reading and writing?
Okay, yes. So when we look at national scores, you can see that Black and Brown students are scoring lower than their counterparts. Even within Black and Brown, Black students are scoring lower than like Hispanic students and so forth. And some of those Hispanic students may speak Spanish at home, whereas Black students may speak AAE at home. But when they come to school, it's generally that Spanish is recognized or they may receive some types of support, whether it's bilingual services, ESOL, ESL services, and so forth. And generally, teachers will take, I can't say at all EPPs, University Educated Preparation Programs, but generally education preparation programs would make them take a course on English language learners, or somehow it's built into their courses that they know a little bit about English language learners. Well, with AAE, it's very rare that there are college courses on AAE. It's very rare that you're going to have a course that embeds it into the curricula throughout the whole program where they're talking about it. So then I end up at these conferences where teachers tell me it's their first time hearing about AAEs. They've never heard about it in like their initial certification program.
Mm.
And even with a survey that I did on spelling, teachers didn't really know which features. I gave them a list of 4 words and shared which one might AAE exert spelling, like AAE spelling, and teachers had difficulty pointing those out. And so one of the questions was something similar to my educator preparation program prepared me to something with AAE. And the majority of those teachers, more than a majority, said that their EPP program, our university program, did not prepare them in African American English. And so we do have a problem when teachers don't know. So they know generally how, I'm not going to say every teacher, but generally they may know how to work with English language learners, but they don't know how to approach African American learners or Black learners, just because in their mind they already speak English, and I'm using air quotes, so General American English. So obviously there's nothing as a teacher they may think that they can do. So I really do like this increased focus. However, in the last few years, on African American English because I do think it's very important that teachers understand. So it's very important, especially in the early years, just because students are learning to decode and they are learning to read, they are learning to encode. And so it plays a big part in their development phonology. And so if your phonological system differs from the phonological system at school, of course, there's going to be some mismatch that occurs that can impede the student from learning General American English. And again, it's about access and access. And then also there's some morphemic differences. For example, African American students sometimes have their entire different vocabulary than what's used at school. So then we have a difference in morphemes as well. And when I say vocabulary, a lot of times people say, oh, is that when, and it's some slang term.
Right.
In this sense, there can be some intersection, of course, between slang and AAE, but I'm not talking about slang in this sense. I'm talking about actual vocabulary that's actually different. Rickford, I want to say 1999, mentioned the term kitchen, how Black people use the term kitchen when we talk about like the hair at the nape of our neck. Well, if a teacher uses the word kitchen for that Black student, it can mean two different things, whether it's your hair or like you're actually, cooking in a kitchen. So there's a vocabulary difference. And Skip Gates from Harvard is spearheading this project with Oxford. They are creating, and he has like top linguists in the field, everyone from Labov to I think Jumbo. I can't remember the whole list. Smitherman, I think, is on there. She's really at the forefront of AA. And so what they're doing is creating an African American English dictionary.
Wow.
And I think this is going to be pivotal for Black students to know that, hey, my language is validated, it's in a dictionary, and this is what this actually means.
Right.
As far as the terms. And then for teachers who may not be familiar with AAE, it could be a starting point to actually use the dictionary to learn vocabulary, but also just understand that this is a very unique, very direct language.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that. And I cannot wait for that to come out. That is phenomenal. So I'd love to leave our listeners today by asking you one question. What is one empowering message you would like to leave our listeners? Now, our listeners are made up of teachers, of school leaders, and families. What's one thing you might tell them when it comes to African American English?
The one thing I would say is to learn more, especially school leaders, because if school leaders understand the impact that language can play in a student's development and identity, that's very important to building that culture at that school. And then also teachers just really understanding more about AAE so that they can provide systematic, explicit instruction. And when those principals go around to do observation, they understand what they're watching and what they're seeing.
Sure.
And I believe in principals actually understanding structured literacy regardless, but
Yes.
they actually understand what they're seeing. One time I was being observed for a teacher evaluation. And my evaluator, my principal, said that I used the word gonna a lot, like next we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that. And so that would just like that's an AAE feature. It's very common
Right.
for me to say. And so just understanding that as far as principals or whomever will be evaluating those teachers, but then teachers actually knowing more about the phonological, morphological, morphosyntactic structure of the language so that they can provide the best possible literacy lessons they can so that those students will leave their classroom knowing efficiently.
Right.
And as far as families, embrace your language, love your children. As Tracy Whedon says, that it is the language of love. Like, this is the language you love your children in. So embrace it. Let them love the language. And I have had teachers who come up to me, Black teachers, who say, "Oh, my mom was a teacher and she didn't let me talk like that. But I wish I had known some of this because I feel left out on some of the things." Like when I said she be telling people she ate for 8 years old from Lisa Green's work, just knowing that that means she might be lying. So, like, the audience would say, "Oh, she's lying or she's telling a story." And so I had a teacher say, "I feel like I'm missing out on like all these underlining meanings and so forth." So again, just embrace the language, love the language. However, also understand that the teacher does have to teach them those structured literacy lessons. And if she's or he, I should say, are teaching those lessons explicitly, direct, and systematic, then embrace that because, again, in Holly Lane's words, we want to give them access so that they can have access.
I love that. I love that so much. It is the language of love. Whatever you are speaking, as long as it's positive to your children, to your students. That's a good word, Ramona. It has been great talking with you today. So how can people stay in touch with you or find your work?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn at Ramona T. Pittman, Ph.D. If you want to email me, I take emails as well. Ramona, Ramona dot Pittman, Pittman, at tamu.edu. And the TAMU is for Texas A&M University. And if I have any resources to share, I share them through email. I actually do have a list but of readings and podcasts and so forth.
It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.